Alrighty, folks, here we go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a slightly different weekly live stream here. We're continuing work with the Mega Gargant, but this time we're actually going to be cracking out the airbrush and doing a little bit of airbrushing. Now, I don't often airbrush on live stream. I don't like talking whilst I'm airbrushing because it means that I can't wear a face mask, and it also means that I can't run the air extractor, which are both things you really should be doing when airbrushing, even with acrylics, which are relatively safe in comparison with enamels and oil paints. Having said that, I do want to do it for this piece because I kind of want to give you guys the end-to-end journey, and because airbrushing is a big part of my process. It's how I make the models look the way that I do. And I wanted to kind of show you some of that as we go. So that's really why I've decided to do this. You will see in some of my pre-recorded videos I do some airbrushing there, but that's a lot easier for me to do because I just record the audio after the fact. So for this one, let us switch camera. We've got a slightly different setup here, as you may have noticed. I'm using, I've got a lot of my stuff unavailable for use at the moment, but I've got a couple webcams here that should hopefully give us good enough resolution. I know the white is kind of blowing out the brightness balance on this, but don't worry. It's not going to stay white for long. And with that, we'll start off with a nice prime. So I've got Stynylrez Res Black Primer, which is what I tend to use when airbrushing. I don't often airbrush primer. I will usually rattle can it, but if I'm doing a display piece or a slightly nicer piece, I will often use the airbrush because I'm less worried about it being durable, which is what the rattle can gives, and more concerned about really controlling the application, which is what the airbrush gives. So with that, hopefully you guys will be able to hear me over the sounds of the compressor. There's not really any way around that. Another problem with doing airbrushing live, I don't know how Kenny Boucher does it, but he does manage to control the audio a little bit better than I can here. So, just gonna be spraying. I'm gonna be, as always, rotating the piece whilst I airbrush so that I'm getting everything. If you try and move the airbrush around too much, you're gonna have a bad time. You're gonna hit problems with the paint splattering out, etc. As you tilt the airbrush. So, I'm going to let the model do all of the moving. Now, because there's so much texture on this piece, the quite a lot of the paint is going to get soaked up by the model, so you can spray a little heavy and it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I'm going to just try and deal with the clog that I'm working against. finally got that clog cleared and we're able to... Whew, man, that stuff smells. Was able to get that cleared out. I'm actually going to switch over airbrush so that hopefully I don't have clogging issues going forwards. So I'm just going to swap my airbrush out for my Evo. Just do a quick clean and flush of that. Alright, so having primed it, we're going to move to our zenithal. Now I've covered this on videos in the past, but when I zenithal a base, I often paint my bases separate to the rest of the model. And when I zenithal a base, I will do it at actually a completely different angle that's really not realistic. But it does introduce more of that contrast. So what I'll be doing is I'll be applying the zenithal at a much steeper angle than you would normally see with the zenithal. Instead of kind of, if this is the model and you're applying the zenithal like this, which is what you'd normally do from about this angle down to about this angle all the way around. Instead, because the base is so flat, if you did those angles, you'd lose pretty much all of your shadow. So for the most part, what I'm going to be doing is passing at a very low angle, as if the sun was just coming over the horizon. But I'm going to move it around a little bit so that it's not all happening in a single direction and casting heavy shadows. Now, in order to speed things up a bit, I'm going to crack out the hairdryer. I'm just going to mute for a second so that your sound does not get blasted by this, because I think this will be pretty loud and I don't want to blow out the sound. Remembering to unmute myself. So we've just given this a quick spritz with the hairdryer just to dry off so that we can keep things moving. So next up, I've got Liquitex acrylic or white ink in my airbrush. That's this paint here, which the light balance isn't going to allow us to see, but it's Liquitex acrylic ink titanium white, which is what I generally use for zenithal. Really flows very nicely through an airbrush, works great. So going to start off with that kind of steep angle application. I'll try and keep the whole thing on camera so you can kind of see. I'm not worried about getting a super heavy coverage right from the get-go. We're going to be doing a few different passes here at different angles. We're also going to be a little bit mindful of where the giant's feet are going to be, where the sack is going to be swinging, because we're going to get some shadow cast from all of that, which we may re-establish after the fact. We're also going to generally put more brightness at the front of the model, which is over here, than towards the rear of it. So we've got some brightness there. We're going to leave a little bit of shade for the sack, a little bit of shade for the rear foot, have it a little bit less bright at the back of the base. Now for our squig here, we are actually going to do a regular zenithal because it's going to be a focus point. We do want that to be really much closer to what you'd really expect. And again, same kind of thing for the fencing. With the fencing, we're also going to kind of make sure that the top is very much brighter than the bottom, and that the front is brighter than the back. Although we will still brighten up the back a little bit so that it continues to be interesting no matter which angle you're looking at things from. And this is all there is to it. We want to kind of go back and forth, bounce around a bit till we've got a degree of brightness that we're happy with. Now, the downside of ink is you cannot apply this too heavily too quickly. If you do, you're going to face a lot of issues with the paint kind of repelling itself and beating up on the surface and then getting pushed around by the flow of air from the airbrush, which causes spidering, which we really don't want. So going to keep this kind of controlled, nice and balanced. We want a little bit of extra brightness on the focal points of the model so that we can really draw attention to them when they're finished. So what I'm going to do, again, just quickly hit this with a hairdryer before I do a little bit more with the white ink. Back again, and we've kind of dried those first few passes. Particularly important for the Squig model because it's such a smooth surface. It doesn't absorb the paint quite as well as the wooden slats and the textured basing. So keep just working on the brightness at the front edge in particular. We want that to really draw the eye. Now, a lot of these light values are going to get lost as we spray on other colors, particularly as I'm using a lot more of the opaque colors than purely translucent colors. But it's still helpful to establish this stuff. It also gets you thinking about the brightness and the positioning of everything that you're dealing with. So if we just kind of sort of just check ourselves on how things are looking. We've got so some interesting insights already is that sack is actually further back than I thought it was. So this area here, which I've left, it's not registering very well, but I've left a little bit darker. I can brighten up. The sack is further back. But other than that, I think we're in a pretty good place for our brightness values. So let me just go in and touch that up. brighten up this side here a little bit. So we've got, it actually shows better on the script camera than it does in reality, the degree of contrast that we've got there. We've still got a little bit of shadow that's being cast by the boulders and stuff, but a lot of it has been lost. That's fine. One of the beautiful things about doing bases with such heavy texture is there's a million different ways of really enhancing those contrast values because you've got the texture to work with. So we'll go into a few of those techniques possibly next week as we move beyond simply airbrushing. So I'm just going to do a quick clean, rinse out the residue paint and switch to our next color. Now, because this is just a color switch, I don't need to be super rigorous in my cleaning. I just want to get rid of the worst of it, and then I can use the new color to flush out a lot of the old color that was in there. So I think that should do it. So next up we're going with a darker brown. I have a lot of the Vallejo Model Air line. I really like them for being able to match with brush paints, and because they're often more muted colors that work great for basing. They have a few vibrant poppy primaries in there, but I think it's just a nice balance of line, and you can just pour it straight into the airbrush without issue. So that's also a nice feature for sure. So I am being pretty light with this. I'm not wanting to lose all of those light values. We're going to have some help re-establishing them a little bit later on, so it's not the end of the world if you do, but I just want to kind of keep those light values present so that I can build off of them as we move on. Now don't worry about the fact that we're turning the Squig brown for now. We're gonna come back and deal with him in a little bit. Now one thing to note is that earth tones are generally pretty warm. You know, this is a fairly reddish brown. Because of that, our shadows, if we stick with just the black shadows, can be a little problematic. So we're going to use some tricks to kind of help with that as we go. Okay, so that's a pretty light application, little patchy, and that's great because the color of earth, etc., is not even. There's a lot of variance. You know, just more of a one mineral or another will impact the color. To that end, we're going to re-establish some of the highlights with Model Air Wood. The previous one was Mud Brown, I think. I'll double check in a second. Mud Brown. This one is Wood. I'm also not really worried about letting layers dry. If these colors blend a little bit, that's absolutely fine. It just helps with the kind of the effect a little bit. What doesn't help is when the airbrush clogs. So we're going to go with a little bit of a patchy effect here, just to texture up stuff. I'm also going to use this as the base coat on the fencing here. Obviously, one of the risks with painting, wooden fencing and wooden buildings on earth is you're dealing with a lot of browns. They're often very similar. You do want to make sure that they're picked out a little bit, probably exaggerating beyond what they would in fact normally really be, because you want to ensure that you've got some visual interest going on. So we're gonna do that here as well. We'll probably actually kind of shade it differently as well, all just to help develop those colors. And you can see this yellowy brown over black actually gives kind of a greenish tint, which will be quite a nice effect once we're done. So just making sure that got those things down to the level that we want. And I think at this point what we can do is we can go back in and work on our squig a little bit. So I'm going back in with highlight colors now. I'm going to put that white back into place, and because of that I'm actually going to clean my airbrush a little bit more thoroughly, because I don't want the browns tinting that white as it comes out and distorting the color effect that we're going for. So a little bit more careful cleaning than I normally do between colors for that reason. Oftentimes I'll try and plan my airbrushing if I'm doing different things or in different areas. I will plan it to really try and avoid the having to go back and forth with colors, trying to move probably from bright down each time. But it's not always possible. For this one we did need to get that mud established before we went in and really picked out the squig again. So the brown is also kind of nice on the squig because it warms up those shadow colors for the red that's coming. So now here what I'm doing is I'm barely moving the trigger back at all, just to really control the extent to which the paint is coming out, so that I'm really spraying very little paint. Now this is something you could not do with a regular white paint very easily, because you'd end up with an awful lot of tip dry, because there's quite a lot of airflow and very little paint flow. It leads to the paint often drying on the needle of the airbrush. But because we're using a white ink here, it is quite a bit more forgiving in this process. So now we are brightening up the area around the squig a little bit as well with the overspray. You could have masked this off. I'm not too worried about it, because I know that we're going to be going through several steps a bit later on that will knock that back noticeably, and we'll re-establish shadows around the squig as you'd expect to see, so it's not too much of a problem. Whilst I have the white in the airbrush, I'm also going to brighten up these little mushrooms again, give them a little bit more of a focus for the viewer as we paint them up. They'll be nice and bright. Again, getting a little bit of overspray here, that'll be fine. I think that should do it for those little things. I'm actually going to just put a hairdryer on this and then maybe do one more pass with the white ink. As I said before, you really do want to make sure that you're building that white ink up over successive layers and letting it cure between them so that you don't get beading and spidering. And remembering to unmute now, so we've just kind of brightened up with the successive pass the mushrooms and the squig again. I also brightened up the top of the fence post a little bit just to highlight that up. Next up is setting up the color for the squig, and the first thing we're going to use for that is just a medium yellow. Maybe visible. The medium yellow is going to give us kind of a little bit more depth to the red that we're going to get subsequently. So this is kind of going in the mid-tone areas. Smooths that transition from light to dark. It gives the red a little bit more range to work with. So let's do a band around the back. Okay, I may have done a little bit of that off camera, so apologies if I did. And we have our little squig with yellow. I'm not sure why this camera is struggling so much with brightness values today. As I said, I'm using a slightly different setup, unfortunately, so I don't have the same degree of control over it, but hopefully it's enough to kind of see roughly what I'm doing. And so now, at long last, we're going to turn our squig red. We've done shading, we've done highlighting, we've done midtones, we've done highlighting. Now we're going to actually base coat. Now this is an ink. This is a game ink, so this is not high opacity. It has a good deal of translucency to it, which will us to keep some of what we had underneath visible. Most of the squashed part of the squig will almost certainly not be visible in the finished thing, but I'm going to colour it just in case it is. So taking our time, being very careful. And what you can see is, hopefully you can see, is that yellow really does add additional warmth to the red. It gives it a bit more depth. Because it's an ink, it is more prone to spidering, so I'm being very careful how much I'm applying in one go. Happy to go back and forth and layer it up as we go. But this should give us a good starting point for our squig. It is showing up as even more red on camera than it is in reality, but he's looking good. So we've got the red done. Now it's time to start building up those shadows, and I'm going to use two different shadow colors for shadowing. The first one is going to be an earthy warm shadow, for which I'm using a burnt umber. Burnt umber is kind of a cool brown, cooler, darker brown. And then for the shadows, I'm going to use Payne's Grey. So the Payne's Grey is going to give us the Gargant shadows. The burnt umber is going to give us the kind of natural earthy shadows. I've got to clean this out quickly. Going from a lighter colour to a darker one, so again it shouldn't be too much of a problem if the airbrush is not completely clean. You're not going to need too much of this. So first thing we're going to do is start getting those shadows back in around our squig. Not too worried about this area, it'll be Gargant shadow. And the other area we're going to establish more shadowing is along what was the fence line. And you can see I've kind of got a straight shot fence line across. Look at the posts, not that fallen plank, but kind of a straight shot fence line there. And this is going to be because I'm going to be building up grasses that are taller along this fence line, where they weren't disturbed. They'll have had more chance to grow and fill out. So this is all looking pretty exaggerated right now, but that's okay. As we start washing things in, etc., this will get knocked back a good amount. Speaking of knocking back, we can start building up more contrast on the rest of the piece as well. First pass on the shadows where the model is, so we can just pop the model on and make sure that we're clear on where those are. So right there and there, under there. And for the sack as well. Now it's looking pretty good. So we're just going to flush that and swap in some Payne's Grey. Payne's Grey is going to be the harsh shadows. I'm actually also going to, looking at that, run the hairdryer over it again as well, just to dry out what we have there, because it's still a little bit wet. It can be tricky knowing when inks are dry, because they'll generally have a glossier finish, but especially where the squig is getting squashed, I can see that it's still quite wet. So I'm gonna just quickly address that. All right, now this is the Payne's Grey. I have already thinned this Payne's Grey. I was getting near the end of the pot and I wanted to get a little bit more life out of it, so it is actually a pre-thinned Payne's Grey. It's not what you would expect to find out of the pot, so do bear that in mind before you apply it as heavily as I am here. You're going to get a different finish. So let me just mute and I'll run the hairdryer over it. And unmute this time without prompting. So, Payne's Grey. Let's just position our Gargant again once more. So there he is, in place, nicely locked in. So that dark patches is looking pretty good. Between the legs we need to exaggerate a little bit more. So I'm going to go in from high angle first to get the between space. I think that covers it pretty well. And there we go. Casting shadows pretty nicely. I'm just going to connect up that bag a little bit. Okay. Now this is looking pretty aggressive right now, but that's nothing to worry about. We'll be fixing that up as we proceed a little bit further. So that is the airbrushing portion of this done. The rest of this is going to be done with a brush. So I'm going to leave it there for now, I think. There we have it, the first stage of airbrushing up our Gargant. Wow, the lighting balance on that is a lot better. Not anymore. As you can see, we've kind of cast our initial shadows. We've got our squig in place and colored up, and we can start working a bit more on that. If we actually position the Gargant into the basing, you can kind of see how those shadows just marry up with where you expect the shadows to be. So it's all looking pretty good. Now the next steps for this are going to be getting the colors on the mushrooms and really fixing up the wood, staining it a little bit with a brush, using a wash, dry brushing over this to desaturate these colors a little bit, move them away from the kind of more vibrant browns into more muted ivories, and detailing up the squig, the mushrooms. Once those bits are done, we'll be starting to add some weathering pigments to help give a little bit of color variance across the surface, and some wash as well. And then we will start adding some static grasses, some phlox. I'm probably not going to use tufts on this. I think I'll probably just actually position and static the grass directly myself, so that I can control it. I definitely want longer tufts along that fence line, with shorter grasses around the edges where it's been trodden down, probably leaving it fairly patchy in places as well, because that's what you would expect to see. I may also pick out a few of these larger stones to be a grey colour, just again to bring in a little bit of variance to the surface of that. But that is where we are for now. I think probably one more session and we'll be finished up with this. We also obviously need to do the lap of victory around the base. I do also have the fallen debris of the fencing. I haven't forgotten that. I didn't think I could do a very good job of painting that on this stream today, so I'm going to do that off camera, just for ease, more than anything. So there we have it. I will try and get some higher quality photos up of that. Post them on my Instagram account. So if you want to check out my Instagram, it is at Raggy Paints. I post a couple times a week at least. I shoot for every day, but I don't always hit it. Generally finished models. I'll sometimes throw in some whips, especially if I'm in the middle of working on some larger projects rather than kind of quick turnaround things. You can also find in-depth kind of detailed articles on ragados.com, raggypaints.com that I write. You can find out more about my affiliates, Herrick Games and Hobbies and Elric's Hobbies. Descriptions for both of those in the comments below. I was customers of them before I became affiliate partners. I still use them extensively, so do consider checking them out. They are both great companies with great customer service and well worth trying. If you use the information and the links in the description below, it also helps me, and I'd really appreciate that. It helps motivate me to keep posting content on here. So please do consider doing that. As always, like, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff. It is appreciated. And for now, I am going to sign off. Later days, everybody.